Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science, by John Tresch, narrated by Paul Woodson. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Art is the perfection of nature. Were the world now as it was the sixth day, there were yet a chaos. Nature hath made one world, and art another. In brief, all things are artificial, for nature is the art of God. Thomas Brown, Religio Medici, 1643. Introduction. Subject: The Universe. At the start of February 1848, New York newspapers announced a mysterious impending event. Edgar A. Poe will lecture at the Society Library on Thursday evening. Subject: The Universe. There could be no grander topic, but no one could say just what to expect. A story? A poem? A critical diatribe? It might contain anything and everything. The Home Journal ventured, "There is but one thing certain about it, that it will be compact of thought, most fresh, startling, and suggestive." As a born anatomist of thought, Mr. Poe takes genius and its limitations to pieces with a skill wholly unequaled on either side the water. The announcements fueled speculation about the man himself. Despite his renown, he had been out of the public eye for more than a year. The venue, newly relocated to Leonard and Broadway, offered few clues. The Society Library's board included social luminaries such as the banker Cornelius Roosevelt. Its fare was more polished than at P.T. Barnum's American Museum, 10 blocks south. Ralph Waldo Emerson had delivered his lecture on the times there, but all manner of entertainments passed through its doors. Recent performances featured Swiss bell ringers, the American Daguerreotype Association, and the stage magician Signor Blitz. Would Poe's lecture be literary, scientific, or some unheralded novelty? The Weekly Universe remarked, "Mr. Poe is not merely a man of science, not merely a poet, not merely a man of letters. He is all combined, and perhaps he is something more." The speech was Poe's return after a fretful absence. He had become famous 3 years earlier with his poem The Raven. Its odd, enticing melody and haunting refrain, uttered by a cryptic bird to a scholar racked with grief, had engraved itself on the public mind. Quoth the raven, nevermore. First published under a pseudonym, it was celebrated, reprinted, and parodied. A Gotham paper raved, "It is written in a stanza unknown before to gods, men, and booksellers, but it fills and delights the ear strangely with its wild and clashing music. Everyone reads the poem and praises it." They also heard it. Poe became a fixture of New York's literary salons, where he magnetized listeners with intense and hushed recitations. The poet Francis Sargent Osgood recalled his proud, beautiful head erect, his dark eyes flashing with the electric light of feeling and of thought. Another author reported his reputation as a practitioner of mesmerism, the new science of invisible fluids and the vibrations that unite minds. People seem to think there is something uncanny about him, and the strangest stories are told, and what is more, believed, about his mesmeric experiences. The Raven opened other doors. In 1845 he gave a lecture titled The Poets and Poetry of America to a crowd of 300, denouncing the feeble state of American writing and criticism, its regional cliques and inflated reputations. By the end of 1846, Poe's poems, tales, unflinching opinions, and flair for provocation had brought him near to his dream of running his own magazine. A sketch of him in the first flush of fame suggests a man of poise, wit, and discernment, with good reason to be optimistic, if perhaps a bit anxious. But his luck changed. For most of 1847 he dropped from salons and lecture halls to whispers of scandal and tragedy. He moved to Fordham, 12 miles north of the city, with his aunt and ailing wife, Virginia. He later confessed to a friend, "I became insane, with long intervals of horrible sanity. During these fits of absolute unconsciousness, I drank. God only knows how often, or how much." Both allies and enemies speculated about his condition. His friend, George Eveleth, a medical student, wrote to the editor, Evert Dykink, "Where is Mr. Poe? What is he doing? And what is he likely to do? Does he continue to drink hard yet, or has he reformed?" His rival, Thomas Dunn English, who had written a novel with a vicious caricature of a drunken Poe, ridiculed his lowered state. "We understand that Mr. E.A. Poe has been employed to furnish the railing for the new railroad over Broadway. He was seen going up the street a few days ago, apparently laying out the road." In fact, withdrawn from the squabbles of the New York papers and salons, safe from public scrutiny and petty attacks, Poe was plotting the next phase of his career. While he was nearly isolated, at one of his lowest moments, his imagination soared. Rambling through Fordham's lush meadows and on the stark, stony cliffs along the Hudson, he undertook daring new works, essays articulating the science of composition. Ulalume, an incantatory ballad lit by the nebulous luster of a newly born star. A visionary tale, the domain of Arnheim, scrawled on a single long scroll, in which an artist of unlimited wealth engineers a vast landscape garden resembling a heaven or a hell. And most audaciously the lecture titled The Universe, which the New York papers announced in early 1848. Poe was pinning his hopes on this work, the first step of his concrete plan to re-establish myself in the literary world. As a magazine writer, he was lucky to receive more than $20 for an article, no matter how widely it was read. A lecture with a decent audience, paying 50 cents each, could earn him several months' rent. He planned to follow the New York event with a national tour, reaping ticket revenues and subscriptions for his reborn literary magazine, The Stylus, starting with his former classmates from the University of Virginia and the U.S. Military Academy. "I must get a list of at least 500 subscribers to begin with. Nearly 200 I have already. I propose, however, to go south and west among my personal and literary friends, old college and West Point acquaintances, and see what I can do." His lecture's published title would be Eureka, an essay on the material and spiritual universe. "Eureka, I found it," was the exclamation of the ancient philosopher Archimedes upon discovering a method for testing the purity of gold. Eureka was also the joyful shout of prospectors in California. Poe was convinced that the discoveries in his essay would secure his immortal fame, make him rich, and by plumbing the mysteries of the universe, save his life. The strategy was less crazy than it might seem. Poe had trained in mathematics and engineering at West Point and spent subsequent decades reviewing fast-breaking developments in electromagnetism, chemistry, natural history, and astronomy. He was positioned as well as nearly any of his contemporaries to speak on cosmology. The origin and makeup of the universe obsessed great minds of the age: Pierre-Simon Laplace, John Herschel, Alexander von Humboldt, and had captivated the American public. The Scottish minister and astronomer Thomas Dick published popular astronomy books that harmonized natural science and Protestant theology, while the 8 volumes of the Bridgewater treatises had updated natural theology to keep pace with scientific advances. The best-selling Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published in Edinburgh in 1844, was still being ferociously debated on both sides of the Atlantic. Scandalously, Vestiges retold the origin and development of the solar system, the sun, the earth, and humanity as the result of uniform natural law, without divine intervention. Was the book's anonymous author a radical, a crank, or a respectable man of science? No one could say. Building on the notoriety of Vestiges, just days before Poe was to speak at the Society Library in early 1848, John Pringle Nichol, professor of astronomy at Glasgow, one of the prime suspects for having written Vestiges, gave a series of well-attended talks in New York. Nicholl had concentrated popular attention on nebulae, remote, shimmering patches of light being closely inspected with powerful new telescopes. According to the nebular hypothesis he advanced, our own sun had once been a whirling, luminous cloud of gas before it condensed, leaving the planets orbiting in its wake. The theological consequences were stark. If true, this hypothesis meant the heavens had gradually evolved into their present state, and the universe had a markedly different history than in Genesis. If such processes of evolution occurred as a result of natural laws without a creator's intervention, they might still be at work beyond our tiny planet, or even here on Earth, in the formation of new species. In and around the cottage in Fordham, his aunt and vigilant protector, Maria Clem, accompanied Poe as he worked. I used to sit up with him, often until 4 o'clock in the morning, he at his desk writing, and I dozing in my chair, she recalled. When he was composing Eureka, we used to walk up and down the garden, his arm around me, mine around him, until I was so tired I could not walk. He would stop every few minutes and explain his ideas to me, and ask if I understood him. I always sat with him when he was writing, and gave him a cup of hot coffee every hour or two. Restlessly walking late into the night, Poe gazed up at the undimmed stars arched above the countryside, wondering where they had come from, and what hints they might hold for those below. Since childhood, Poe had been looking to the stars, peering through his British-made telescope from the balcony of his foster father's Richmond mansion, polishing lenses as an artillery engineer in the U.S. Army, setting one of his earliest poems, Al-Araf, on a new star observed by the astronomer Tycho Brahe. Like C. Auguste Dupin, the gentleman investigator Poe introduced in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first modern detective story, Poe suspected that the constellations he observed on his night walks held clues to the early history of the universe and the laws governing its life and death. Poe spent January 1848 revising his lecture, like the scholar in The Raven, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. He hired the Society Library and called on friends in the press to announce the event. Yet the weather was beyond his control. The chosen night, February 3rd, a year and 4 days after his wife's death, a storm struck the city. When Poe stepped to the lectern, dressed with simple elegance in a black suit with an immaculately clean, if threadbare, collar and neckerchief, and placed before him a stack of manuscript pages covered with his minuscule and regular handwriting, a mere 60-odd people had braved the cold to attend, a select but highly appreciative audience. Undaunted, Poe unraveled the mystery of the universe. "I have seen no portrait of Poe," a listener remarked, "that does justice to his pale, delicate, intellectual face and magnificent eyes. His lecture was a rhapsody of the most intense brilliancy. He appeared inspired, and his inspiration affected the scant audience almost painfully." The core of Poe's lecture was a new creation story, marked with strange and poetic symmetries, a theory of the formation of stars, extending the nebular hypothesis to the universe as a whole. Everything in his telling began with a single unitary particle that exploded outward to the limits of the universe of stars, its diffused matter gathering in nebular clouds. These clouds then condensed inward, forming suns and planets. Yet the inward force of gravity was countered by a rival repulsive force that Poe called electricity, the cause of all phenomena of vitality, consciousness, and thought. For eons the two principles had been locked in struggle, generating the diverse beings that filled Earth and other planets. Eventually, gravity would take the upper hand, and with a millionfold electric velocity, all matter would rush back together, hurtling once more into the absolute unity of the primordial particle. A reporter for the Morning Express described the lecture as the most elaborate and profound he had ever heard. It was greeted with warm applause by the audience, who had listened with enchained attention throughout. Poe saw Eureka as the culmination of his writings, his dreams, and his ill-starred life. He told a friend that it was destined to revolutionize the world of physical and metaphysical science. I say this calmly, but I say it. When it was published, he wrote to his mother-in-law, "I have no desire to live since I have done Eureka. I could accomplish nothing more." He died the next year. The Poe Effect. Many of Poe's devoted fans, whether they revere him as the mastermind of horror, inventor of the detective story, pioneer of science fiction, high priest of symbolist art, or brooding prince of the Goths, have never read Eureka, the cosmological theory he propounded that night in 1848. Beyond its length, and the difficulties of its form and argument, Eureka seems out of place among Poe's most famous works, whether his outrageous tales of horror and madness, or his hymns to ethereal beauty. This book tells the full story of Edgar Allan Poe's life, but it does so from a new angle. It returns Poe's cosmology to its place at the summit of his life and thought, showing his work as a singular expression of the tumultuous ideas and passions of his age, thoroughly bound up with the emergence of modern science. Poe explored the exhilarating prospects and treacherous blind spots of science's powerful new ways of assembling the world. Understanding his life and work demands close attention to his multiform engagements with these theories, methods, and discoveries. In return, Poe's life and works are vividly revealing of modern science in a decisive moment. The historian and philosopher Thomas Kuhn labeled the first half of the 19th century the Second Scientific Revolution. With methods of precise measurement and calculation, researchers were consolidating the programs of the 17th century. The First Scientific Revolution, identified with Bacon, Kepler, Descartes, Galileo, and Newton, while scientific fields diversified and expanded. Poe's case sheds distinctive light on the obsessions and controversies of early 19th century science as it unfolded in America. His work embodies its defining tensions between popular diffusion and elite control, between empathy and detachment, between inspired enthusiasm and icy materialism. Poe argued that every word and image in a poem or tale should contribute to a single, deliberately chosen effect. His works deliver a dazzling array of shocks and delights, effects of terror, humor, disgust, sublimity. Yet a second moment often follows the initial blow. Attentive readers might wonder, how did he do it? What combination of words, expectations, and publicity allowed him to strike such a concussion upon the individual and collective mind? Further questions might follow. Were these the techniques of a high and inspired art, or crude tricks to trigger base reactions? In cases where Poe attained an effect of reality, or verisimilitude, readers might ask, is this a true report of facts or a hoax, a humbug? The Poe effect was an exclamation point followed by a question mark, a striking, concentrated impact that left the reader wondering after a chain of causes. These led back to a captivating but elusive source, Poe himself. Poe's fantastic tales, detective stories, and nonfiction writings dramatized the act of inquiry and the struggles, fears, hopes, and delusions of the human being undertaking it. His invention of new sensations and his search for hidden causes place him at the center of the maelstrom of American science in the first half of the 19th century. The senses of Poe and his contemporaries were bombarded with new technical effects, electromagnetic signals, brilliant light shows, musical innovations, clattering city streets, mesmeric emanations, machine-printed words. They were also confronted with new methods and theories for analyzing the universe, curing illness, justifying political decisions, organizing society, and shaping minds. Today's image of science is of laboratories, microscopes, and white coats. A regulated and uniform undertaking, heavily funded by government and recognized as the best, indeed for some the only, means of obtaining reliable knowledge about the world. Yet, as Poe embarked on his career in the 1830s, this image of science was at best a distant dream. The term scientist was coined only in 1833 to replace the generalist natural philosopher. In Europe, the fallout from Napoleon's wars and the dawning Industrial Revolution prompted violent conflicts over rights and property, belief and expertise. The scientific situation in the United States was even more chaotic because national traditions and institutional frameworks did not yet exist. In the popular press and lecture halls, self-appointed experts announced dubious observations and flamboyant theories on every topic. No sufficiently powerful authorities existed, whether scientific associations, national academies, or peer-reviewed journals, to separate reliable claims from errors or outright fraud. But the current was beginning to shift. In Poe's time, a number of aggressive, well-connected reformers, whose paths Poe crossed and recrossed, and whose discoveries and inventions he digested and reviewed, began to refashion science into a set of interwoven claims about how to inhabit the world, a driving force for material improvements, a unified image of knowledge and nature. As we will see, for Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson, Alexander Dallas Bache, and his close allies, the physicist Joseph Henry and the mathematician-astronomer Benjamin Peirce, fostering science was fundamental to building America as a unified nation. They strove to establish well-organized, federally supported institutions for training and research. They saw these as crucial supports for state power, industrial development, and territorial conquest. Woven through the era's conflicts, science was just beginning to coalesce into the powerful, if at times threatened, institution we recognize today. Writing and reflecting on the range of his era's sciences, Poe often joined his voice to these calls for scientific institutionalization and expansion. At the same time, he scrutinized and satirized science's rise. He made it clear that science would take root only by persuading people to follow a specific utopian vision, and that the lines between truth and illusion, reason and irrationality, common sense and madness, were shifting and unstable. At times he explicitly aligned himself with the projects of scientific reformers such as Bache and Henry, echoing their calls to put American intellectual life on a new, more solid footing. At other times, he mocked the reductive simplifications that modern science offered up as the last word on any topic, and tweaked his contemporaries' credulity with hoaxes to rival P.T. Barnum's. In wide-ranging philosophical works, including Eureka, he offered an alternative vision of science and the cosmos, in which intuition, feeling, and imagination played leading roles. Poe wrote both with and against the emerging scientific consensus. His deep familiarity with science was the fulcrum on which his thought balanced. Though later thinkers have drawn heavily on his work, including the linguist Roman Jakobson, the philosophers of science Charles Sanders Peirce and Gaston Bachelard, and Freud's student Marie Bonaparte, who promoted psychoanalysis by examining his thought, there was, of course, much more to Poe than his scientific obsessions. Every junior high student knows him as an exacting artist of atmosphere and anxiety. He was a verbal virtuoso, attuned to words, sounds, and depths of meaning, and a compelling advocate for beauty of an exquisitely irregular sort. Working in a stunning variety of styles, genres, and tones, he conjured up sublime landscapes, hypnotic interiors, and compellingly disturbed characters, demonstrating to later writers all that the short story could be: an aesthetic experiment, a study of anomalous psychology, a philosophical investigation, a wild ride of beauty and fear. Poe spoke for the tormented, the cursed, the exiled, and the strange. even as he explained with rigorous clarity the abstract and universal principles of art. Through the writers he profoundly influenced, Baudelaire, Dostoevsky, Verne, Lovecraft, Conan Doyle, Nabokov, Highsmith, and Borges among them, Poe shaped the course of modern literature. He is now one of the most widely read writers of fiction in any language. With the frantic, grotesque juxtapositions of his work, he is also perhaps the most American of authors. Observing the national experiment from high and low, from positions of both extreme privilege and extreme deprivation, Poe was a seismograph registering the volatility of his place and time. Written in dialogue with the distinctive cultural activity of the country's major cities, Richmond, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, his works bring to light the violence, anxiety, feverish idealism, and horror that were indissociable from the building of the United States. Despite the myths and clichés about him, Poe was not a morbid, melancholy dreamer, prone to slip at the slightest suggestion into an earth-shaking alternate reality. Or rather, he was that and something more. Poe experienced great misfortune, much of which he brought upon himself. But as his portrait suggests, he faced up to his life with dignity, kindness, a sense of duty, and a sense of fun. One of the first Americans to earn his living by literature alone, he forced himself through unprecedented contortions to capture readers and fame. But he aimed higher. Glancing compulsively up to the skies, he was an analyst, a philosopher, and a detective, seeking to crack the code of the universe. With exceptionally keen eyes, Poe followed the dazzling trail of the strange and contradictory nation that produced him and the sublime, terrifying modernity it was bringing down to earth. Part 1. From Allan to Poe. A dark, unfathomed tide of interminable pride, a mystery and a dream, should my early life seem. Poe, Imitation. 1. The Young Astronomer. In the swampy heat of the summer of 1825, anyone walking past the mansion on the corner of Fifth and Main could look up and see a slender young man on the balcony making fine adjustments to a telescope. The house stood on Shockoe Hill, sloping down to the James, the tidal river that opened Richmond to the sea. As he peered through the instrument of glass, wood, and brass, the youth alternated between careful motions and patient stillness. By day he could track boats coming in and out on the tide. At night he followed the stars. The 16-year-old astronomer was Edgar Allan, sometimes called Eddie, sometimes Edgar Poe. He knew the constellations as maps, legends, and calculable motions. With bright hazel eyes and sharp, delicate features, he had a quick and supple mind. Some compared his animated, dignified bearing to a bird's. At Richmond Academy, the school for young gentlemen he'd attended since 1821, he excelled in languages, rhetoric, and the astronomy, conic sections, algebra, fluxions, mechanics, its curriculum boasted. Edgar was an orphan, the only child in his foster family. He and his friends would run through the woods beyond the city, testing each other in boxing matches, pranks, and dares. Once he swam 6 miles across the widest expanse of the James, a feat he compared to Lord Byron's paddle across the Hellespont. He also followed Byron as a poet. His heart, he wrote, was a chaos of deep passion that he poured into musical, brooding verses. He lost himself in novels, adventure stories, history books, and the magazines sold in the store owned by his foster father, John Allan. In appearance and character, Allan had little in common with Edgar. Large and heavy-set, Allan was a man concerned with social standing and the satisfaction of his desires. He traded Virginia's pungent tobacco, the crop grown on plantations to the west and south. Harvested by African slaves, on land seized from Native Americans, its leaves were bundled together and loaded onto carts to Richmond, where it was sold, secured and packed for shipment to northern states and England. Allan cared.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?